My name is Dana Kessler, and on the day my ex-husband handed my 3-month-old daughter to his mother in a hospital parking lot, I could not stand up to stop him. I was 32 years old, a lieutenant colonel, with 14 years of active duty behind me, and I was lying in a bed at Walter Reed with 2 titanium rods in my spine, listening to him tell a nurse I was not stable enough to parent. If you are watching this from a base you have shipped out from a hospital room you have counted ceiling tiles in, or from a courtroom bench you never thought you would sit on, type it below, and if you know what it means to be underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best, hit like and subscribe before we go any further, because you are going to need to see this through to the end. There are 3 things you need to hold on to as I tell you this story. The first is a manila envelope, sealed with a Department of the Army classification stamp, that sat in a safety deposit box in Fayetteville, North Carolina for 9 years, waiting for the day someone finally had the authority to open it in front of a judge. The second is a sentence my mother-in-law said to a room full of people at my own daughter's christening, a sentence she believed no one important enough to matter would ever repeat back to her. The third is a single line, 4 sentences long, buried on page 11 of a personnel file marked Operation Nightfall, Eyes Only, Distribution Limited. A line that nobody in that courtroom, least of all the man who filed for sole custody of my daughter 9 years later, expected a judge to read out loud. I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before I was ever somebody's ex-wife. I enlisted at 19, the year after my father died of a heart attack, in the driveway of our house in Lubbock, Texas, still wearing his own army boots from a war I only knew from the way his hands shook sometimes at dinner. I went in as a combat medic, and by the time I was 26 I had a commission, a master's degree in emergency medicine, paid for by the Army, and orders to a unit whose name I was not permitted to say out loud to my own mother. Officially, for the next 8 years, my personnel record listed me as a medical liaison officer, assigned to a logistics support battalion at Fort Bragg. Unofficially, I was the field medical lead, attached to a joint special operations task force, the officer who briefed extraction teams on trauma protocols before they went out the door of a helicopter into the dark, and the officer who was sometimes on that helicopter herself when the numbers did not add up any other way. I made first lieutenant, then captain, then major, each promotion arriving with a security clearance renewal, instead of a parade. Each deployment logged in a file that said little more than duty station, classified, to anyone without the right badge. I met Bradley Turner in 2012, at a hospital fundraiser in Fayetteville, where I had been sent, still in uniform, to represent the base Surgeon General's office. He was 29 then, an assistant director of hospital operations at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center. Tall, easy with a room, the kind of man who could make a stranger feel like the only interesting person at a party of 400 people. He asked what I did for the Army. I told him what my orders let me tell him, medical liaison, logistics, paperwork mostly, and he laughed and said that was probably for the best, because he could not imagine me anywhere near a firefight. I remember exactly how that sentence landed, warm and a little condescending at the same time, like a hand on the top of my head. I married him 14 months later anyway, on the 6th of April 2013, at a small chapel outside Fayetteville, my mother crying in the second row, and his mother, Diane Turner, sitting in the front row, in a cream-colored suit, already looking at me the way you look at a stain you are hoping will come out in the wash. For the first 2 years of our marriage, Bradley told people at dinner parties that his wife did something with Army supply chains. I let him. Every classified deployment I came home from, Kandahar province in the spring of 2014, a joint operations center outside Jalalabad that winter, a stretch of 11 weeks in 2015, I still cannot fully describe in a video like this one, got folded into that same soft, forgettable phrase. Diane Turner, who had raised Bradley alone after his father left when he was 6, decided early on that I was not quite what her son deserved. She had wanted a doctor, or at minimum a nurse, with a recognizable job title she could repeat to her book club. Instead, she got a daughter-in-law who left for months at a time and came back saying almost nothing about where she had been, And Diane filled that silence with her own conclusions. She probably just files paperwork somewhere safe. I heard her tell a cousin at a 4th of July barbecue in 2014, not realizing I was standing close enough to hear it over the sound of the sprinklers. I did not correct her. I could not have, even if I had wanted to. Some sacrifices do not come with an audience. And I had made my peace with that a long time, before I made my peace with marrying into this family. I found out I was pregnant in September of 2014, 3 days before I left for what my orders called a training rotation, and what was actually a 6-month deployment to a forward operating base outside Kandahar, attached to a task force running high-risk personnel recovery. I did not tell Bradley the real nature of the deployment, because I could not, and by then I had also stopped correcting the story he told about me, because it was easier than watching his face try to decide whether to be proud or embarrassed. I gave birth to our daughter, Emily Rose Turner, on the 14th of April 2015, 3 weeks after I returned stateside, still carrying 11 pounds I had not carried before I left, and a hairline fracture in my left wrist from a hard landing I never explained to anyone outside my chain of command. 8 weeks later, with Emily barely sleeping through the night, I deployed again, my last deployment, though none of us knew that yet, to a joint operations center near Jalalabad. This time, as the senior medical officer, attached to a task force running extraction operations along a mountain corridor that does not appear on any map you can search for at home. That deployment had a name inside the classified system, Operation Nightfall. I am only permitted to say that much to you now, because 9 years later, a federal judge said it out loud in open court, and once a name is read into a public record, it stops being a secret and starts being history. On the 11th of November 2015, an improvised explosive device detonated under the vehicle in front of mine during a night extraction of 11 soldiers pinned down after a compromised operation. I do not talk in detail about what happened in the 90 minutes after that. Not in a video, not to my own mother, but I will tell you the medical outcome, because it is a matter of record. I sustained a T11 vertebral fracture, a traumatic brain injury, classified as moderate, and second-degree burns across the back of my left arm. I was medevaced to Landstuhl, then to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, where I arrived on the 16th of November, unable to feel my legs, with Emily 7 months old, and being cared for by my mother back in Fayetteville, because Bradley had told my mother he had a big project at the hospital and could not take leave. I lay in that bed at Walter Reed for 11 weeks. Bradley visited 4 times. On his 4th visit, on the 9th of February 2016, he did not sit down. He stood at the foot of my bed in his grey wool coat, still smelling faintly of a perfume that was not mine, and he told me he had already retained an attorney, and that he believed, given my current state, it would be better for Emily if she stayed primarily with him and his mother going forward. He used the words current state twice in that conversation, the way you might describe a used car you were trying not to overpay for. I remember the fluorescent light over his shoulder, the smell of the antiseptic wipe the nurse had used on my IV port 20 minutes earlier, the particular flat, cold sound of the divorce filing when it landed on the tray table beside my water cup 3 days later, on the 12th of February 2016. Diane Turner drove up from Fayetteville that same week, not to see me, but to collect Emily's things from our house, while I was still 300 miles away in a hospital bed. A neighbor called to tell me. That is how I learned my daughter had been moved out of her own nursery, from a neighbor, on a payphone in a hospital hallway, because my own cell phone had died, and no one in my husband's family thought to charge it for me. What Bradley did not know, what almost no one outside 11 people in the Department of the Army knew, was that 4 days before that IED detonated, I had signed a set of after-action statements and a personnel recommendation that would sit sealed in a Department of the Army records facility for the next 9 years, pending a security review that nobody, least of all me, expected to move quickly. My commanding officer at the time, Brigadier General Harold Voss, had submitted paperwork recommending me for a Silver Star for actions taken during the extraction, specifically for making 2 trips back into contact under fire to carry wounded soldiers to the landing zone after our combat medic was killed. That file, call number NF-2015-1187, cross-reference to Operation Nightfall, went into a manila envelope, then into a safety deposit box at a credit union in Fayetteville that only I and later, one attorney, would ever have the combination to. I did not tell Bradley it existed. I did not tell Diane. I certainly did not tell a family court judge, because in February of 2016, lying in a hospital bed, with a body that would not move the way I told it to, I had no idea I would ever need to. The divorce was finalized on the 3rd of August 2016, 6 months after the filing landed on my hospital tray table, and by the time the ink was dry, I already knew about Jessica Voss, though at the time, I did not yet know she carried the same last name as the general who had once written my Silver Star recommendation, a coincidence that would matter enormously 9 years later. Jessica was the Director of Public Relations at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, 28 years old in 2016, with a corner office 2 doors from Bradley's, and, according to 2 separate former co-workers, who eventually spoke to my attorney under oath, a habit of eating lunch behind a closed office door with him at least 3 times a week, going back to the spring of 2015, which meant Bradley had been building a second life while I was still carrying our daughter, and had certainly been building it well before an IED gave him an excuse to leave. He married Jessica on the 17th of June 2017, 10 months after our divorce was final, in a ceremony at a country club outside Fayetteville that I heard about from my own daughter, then 2 years old, who came back from a weekend visitation asking why Daddy and the pretty lady got married without me. Custody, in that first arrangement, was split on paper, joint legal custody, with me holding primary physical custody, and Bradley receiving alternating weekends, and 1 extended block each summer. But it was a fragile arrangement from the start, propped up mostly by my own physical recovery, which took the better part of 3 years. 2 spinal surgeries, and a medical retirement from the Army that I did not choose, that was chosen for me by a medical evaluation board in March of 2018, closing out 14 years, 1 month, and 19 days of service, with a final rank of Lieutenant Colonel and a disability rating of 70%. I raised Emily largely alone for the next several years, in a rented house 11 minutes from the base, on a combined income of a military pension of $4,380 a month, and Veterans Affairs disability compensation of just over $3,200 a month, working part-time as a clinical instructor at a physician assistant program, because full-time civilian employment with my back the way it was, remained, for a long time, physically out of reach. Bradley, meanwhile, was promoted to Vice President of Operations at the hospital system in 2019, remarried, comfortable, photographed at galas, standing next to Jessica, in dresses that cost more than my monthly pension. Diane Turner told anyone who would listen that Emily was thriving now that there was some real stability in her life, a sentence engineered, I always believed, to be repeated back to me. And every single one of these years, that manila envelope sat in a safety deposit box in Fayetteville, because the review board handling the declassification of Operation Nightfall records moved at the pace such boards move, and because I had never once, in 9 years, considered using my own service record as a weapon in a family court. I want to be honest with you about that. I was not saving that file for a courtroom. I was saving it because it was the only proof left, anywhere, that 11 men were alive because of a decision I made in the dark, on the 11th of November 2015, and some proof you keep, not because you plan to use it, but because you cannot make yourself throw it away. If you have ever kept something, a letter, a medal, a record of who you really are, folded up and hidden, because the people around you had already decided who you were instead, stay with me, because it is about to matter more than it ever has. And if this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest, hit subscribe now, because what happens in that courtroom is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. Diane Turner's contempt never needed a special occasion. It came out at Emily's christening in May of 2015, 3 weeks after I had come home, visibly changed by a deployment no one at that party could name, when Diane leaned toward her sister at the reception table and said, just loud enough, "She was never really a soldier, you know. Just secretarial work. Filing, mostly." I was standing 11 feet away, holding my own daughter, and I said nothing, because I had signed paperwork years earlier that made saying anything impossible. It came out again at Emily's 7th birthday party in 2022, when Diane told a table of other mothers that she worried about what kind of example I was setting, working some vague desk job, while Bradley had built a real career. And it came out a final time, 6 months before the custody filing, that would upend everything. At a school recital, when Diane cornered my mother in the parking lot and told her that Emily deserved a stable home with 2 working professionals, a phrase she used with the practiced ease of someone rehearsing a line for a jury she had not yet realized she would eventually face. Jessica Voss's arrogance was quieter than Diane's, more calculated, delivered mostly through emails and custody exchange text messages that read, on their surface, entirely reasonable. In the spring of 2023, when I asked to adjust a pickup time because of a physical therapy appointment related to hardware still in my spine, Jessica responded on Bradley's behalf. He rarely wrote to me directly by then, with a message that read, in part, that consistency matters more for Emily's development than accommodating scheduling issues on your end, as though 8 years of chronic pain from an injury sustained protecting 11 strangers was a scheduling issue. She repeated a version of that same sentence in a custody mediation session in September of 2023, telling the mediator, in a tone so even it barely registered as an insult, that she and Bradley could offer Emily genuine professional stability that my limited work history could not. I watched the mediator write that phrase down. I watched Jessica smile very slightly when he did. Roland Pierce, Bradley's attorney, built his entire practice on exactly this kind of case, and he brought a performative, courtroom-trained arrogance into every interaction, the kind that assumes the other side has already lost and simply has not been informed yet. I met him for the first time at that same September 2023 mediation, where he opened by describing my military background as administrative experience, primarily logistics and support functions, a characterization pulled almost word for word from the cover story I had maintained for a decade. And he used it as the foundation for an argument that I lacked demonstrated capacity for high-stakes decision-making, relevant to a child's welfare. He said this while looking directly at me, waiting, I think, for me to correct him, to defend myself, to hand him something he could use. I did not. I simply wrote the date down in a small notebook I had started keeping in 2022, on the advice of an attorney I had quietly retained the year before, a notebook that, by the time this story reaches its courtroom, would contain 41 dated entries documenting exactly this pattern, each one small on its own, each one part of something much larger when read together. The filing came on the 4th of March 2024, delivered by a process server to my front porch on a Tuesday afternoon, while Emily was still at school. Bradley Turner, through Roland Pierce, was petitioning for sole legal and primary physical custody of Emily Rose Turner, then 9 years old, citing what the filing called a documented pattern of physical limitation and emotional unavailability on my part, along with an affidavit from Diane Turner describing me as increasingly withdrawn and inconsistent. There was a second document attached, one that made my hands go cold reading it in my own driveway, a letter from a licensed clinical counselor named Dr. Renee Costello, whom I had never met, whom Emily had apparently been seeing at Bradley's arrangement for 4 months without my knowledge or consent, describing Emily as expressing confusion and distress about my capacity to care for her. I found out later, through my attorney's investigation, that Dr. Costello's practice had received $11,000 in referral payments from a wellness consulting firm that listed Jessica Voss as a board member. That detail alone would take 4 months to document and verify. I did not have 4 months of patience left in me, but I had spent 14 years learning how to sit still under fire. So I sat still, and I called the one person I trusted more than anyone left in my life, who was not wearing a uniform anymore. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, United States Army, retired, had been a Judge Advocate General officer for 26 years before he opened a small family law practice 15 minutes from Fort Bragg, specifically to represent veterans navigating civilian courts that did not understand what a DD-214 actually meant. I had met him in 2021 at a veterans support group I attended twice a month, the same group where I had met my closest friend since the Army, Staff Sergeant Renata Cole, who had served 2 tours as a combat engineer, and who, unlike almost everyone else in my civilian life, never once asked me to explain or justify what 4 years of my service record still said classified beside. Renata was the one who sat with me on my kitchen floor the night the custody filing arrived, who made me eat something, who told me, in the flat, unsentimental way only another veteran could get away with, that I was allowed to stop protecting people who had never once tried to protect me. Marcus was the one who, 3 days later, sitting across from me at his office with the filing spread out between us, asked a single question that changed the shape of everything that followed. He asked whether the administrative role described in the opposing filing was the complete picture of my service record, or whether there was more sitting somewhere that a court had never seen. I told him about the envelope. I told him about Operation Nightfall, about General Voss, about the Silver Star recommendation that had been sitting in review for 9 years. Marcus went very quiet for a long moment, and then he told me something I had never let myself consider, that a declassification review could, under specific and rare circumstances, be expedited when a veteran's service record was being actively misrepresented in a pending legal proceeding, particularly one affecting custody of a minor child. He filed the emergency declassification request on the 22nd of March 2024. It would take 11 weeks, and a phone call from Brigadier General Harold Voss himself, now retired and living in Colorado Springs, to move it through. Those 11 weeks were the longest of my life outside of a combat zone, which is a strange thing to say, and an entirely true one. I sat through 2 more mediation sessions where Roland Pierce grew visibly more confident, at one point telling the mediator that my continued silence about my actual employment history only confirmed there was nothing there worth mentioning. I sat through a home visit from a court-appointed custody evaluator, a careful, decent woman named Patricia Nguyen, who asked me directly why my service record was so sparse, and to whom I said only that some parts of it were still under review and would be available before the hearing, a sentence I repeated so many times over those 11 weeks that it started to feel like the only true thing left in my mouth. I sat through a phone call from Diane Turner, the only one she had made to me in 3 years, in which she told me, almost gently, that sometimes the kindest thing a mother can do is admit when someone else can offer more, and I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, thinking that she had no idea, none at all, what I had already given, and what I was 11 weeks away from being finally allowed to say. The hearing date was set for the 4th of June 2024 in the Cumberland County Family Courthouse, Courtroom 4B, before the Honorable Miriam Castellano, a judge with a reputation, according to Marcus, for reading every page of every exhibit herself before a hearing rather than relying on summaries from clerks. The declassification approval, signed by the Department of the Army's Records Review Authority, arrived by secure courier to Marcus's office at 6:40 in the morning on the 3rd of June, less than 24 hours before the hearing. The manila envelope from the Fayetteville Safety Deposit Box, now paired with an official cover letter, authorizing its contents to be entered into evidence in a civil proceeding. General Voss flew in from Colorado Springs that same afternoon, in his own dress uniform, to testify in person rather than by affidavit, a detail his own attorney told him was unnecessary, and which he did anyway, telling Marcus over the phone, "Some things you say to a person's face or you don't say them at all." Renata drove me to the courthouse the next morning and sat in the 3rd row of the gallery, in a blazer instead of a uniform, close enough that I could see her out of the corner of my eye for the first time all morning, that I did not feel entirely alone. The courtroom that morning smelled the way every government building smells, of floor wax and old paper, and the particular flat air of a room with windows that do not open, and the gallery was fuller than I expected. Bradley's cousins, 2 of Jessica's co-workers, A scattering of other veterans Marcus had quietly told about the hearing, drawn, I think, by the same instinct that made Renata drive me there at 7 in the morning. Bradley sat at the petitioner's table in a grey suit that cost more than my monthly disability check, Jessica directly behind him in the front row of the gallery, Diane beside her, already composing her face into the expression of quiet, aggrieved patience I had watched her practice for 9 years. Judge Castellano entered at 9:02, and the bailiff's announcement, the particular hard, flat sound of her gavel against the block, was the last ordinary sound I remember before everything in that room changed. Roland Pierce opened for the petitioner exactly as he had rehearsed in mediation, describing me, once again, as a woman whose military career had consisted of administrative and logistical support duties, a woman whose limited and largely clerical employment history left her unable to provide the professional stability and consistency that Emily needed. A phrase I now understood he had built an entire legal strategy around, brick by brick, over 4 months, never once suspecting the bricks were sitting on top of a foundation that had already been declassified and delivered to my attorney's office the morning before. Dr. Renee Costello testified next, describing Emily's supposed distress in careful clinical language that fell apart within 6 minutes of cross-examination, when Marcus produced the referral payment records connecting her practice to Jessica's wellness consulting firm, and Judge Castellano, for the first time that morning, set down her pen and looked directly at the witness stand for a long, silent moment before instructing the clerk to flag the testimony for further review. Diane Turner testified after her, repeating, almost word for word, the sentence she had said at Emily's christening 9 years earlier. "She was never really a soldier, Your Honor. It was mostly filing, secretarial work, that sort of thing. And I watched Judge Castellano write something down, and I did not yet know it was a note to herself. A single line she would return to less than 20 minutes later." I sat very still at the respondent's table while Diane spoke, my hands flat on the cool wood in front of me, the way I had once held my hands flat on a helicopter deck, waiting for a signal, and I noticed, in the strange sideways attention that comes with 14 years of training your body not to react, the exact sound the ceiling fan made overhead, a faint irregular tick every third rotation, and the smell of the courtroom, dust and floor polish, and, faintly, the ozone smell of an old fluorescent ballast somewhere behind the bench, and I thought, not for the first time that morning, that I had been in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and had never once had to fight the particular urge I was fighting now, which was simply to stand up and speak before I was called. Marcus called me to the stand first. Then, after 11 minutes of foundational testimony about my medical retirement and my disability rating, he called Brigadier General Harold Voss, United States Army, retired, who walked to the witness stand in his dress uniform with the particular unhurried bearing of a man who had briefed rooms far more hostile than this one. Marcus entered the declassified file, case number NF-2015-1187, into evidence, and Judge Castellano read the cover authorization herself, silently, for nearly 90 seconds, while the entire courtroom sat in a silence so complete I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. Then General Voss testified, in plain, unadorned language, that on the night of the 11th of November 2015, then Captain Dana Kessler made 2 unordered trips back into an active kill zone, under direct enemy fire, after the unit's combat medic was killed, to carry 2 critically wounded soldiers to a landing zone, actions for which he had personally recommended her for the Silver Star, a recommendation that had remained sealed pending declassification review for 9 years. Not because there was anything to hide, but because the operational details of Operation Nightfall implicated ongoing intelligence sharing arrangements that required time and authority and patience to release. Judge Castellano asked General Voss to read one specific line from the file into the record, a line she had marked with a small tab of yellow paper while reviewing the exhibit. The closing line of his original after-action recommendation, written by hand in the field within 72 hours of the extraction. General Voss read it exactly as written. Captain Kessler did not file paperwork that night. Captain Kessler carried the 11 men on that mountain home, 1 on each of 2 trips, under fire, and she has not once, in 9 years, told anyone what that cost her, which is the truest measure of the officer she is. The courtroom did not make a sound. I watched Bradley's face go the color of the manila folder sitting open on the evidence table, a grey-white I had genuinely never seen on him before, in 9 years of marriage and 9 years after it. He half rose from his chair, one hand flat on the table, and said, quiet enough that only the first 2 rows could hear it clearly, "Wait, that cannot be true." And Roland Pierce, beside him, said nothing at all, because there was nothing left in his 4-month strategy, built to survive contact with a Silver Star recommendation, and a brigadier general willing to fly across the country to read it out loud. Judge Castellano did not rule immediately. She set down the file, looked out at the gallery, at Diane Turner's face, at Jessica Voss sitting very still beside her, at the row of veterans Marcus had quietly told, at Renata sitting straight-backed in her blazer, and she said, in the flat, deliberate cadence of someone building a ruling in real time, that she had, in 11 years on the family court bench, rarely seen a petition built so entirely on a mischaracterization the court itself had just watched dismantled in open testimony, and that she would be denying the petition for sole custody in full, ordering primary physical custody to remain with me, and referring both Dr. Costello's testimony and the undisclosed referral payments to the State Licensing Board for review. The months that followed unfolded exactly as unevenly as 9 years of quiet contempt deserved to. Dr. Renee Costello's license was suspended by the State Board in September of 2024, pending a formal investigation into the referral payments, and her practice closed permanently by December. Roland Pierce's firm quietly declined to represent Bradley in the follow-up hearings that fall, a courtesy withdrawal his office attributed to scheduling conflicts, that Marcus, with a small, tired smile, told me was legal speak for a firm protecting its own reputation. Jessica Voss resigned from her position at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center in October of 2024, after 2 of her own co-workers, the same ones who had once described a habit of closed-door lunches with Bradley, going back to 2015, gave sworn statements as part of the licensing board's inquiry into the wellness consulting firm's referral arrangements. She and Bradley separated in January of 2025, a fact I learned not from either of them but from Emily, who mentioned it the way 9-year-olds mention things, sideways, over cereal, without any particular weight attached. Diane Turner has not spoken to me since the hearing, though she still sees Emily on the alternating weekends the revised custody order preserves for Bradley, and Emily tells me her grandmother is quieter now, a detail I have chosen, deliberately, not to feel much of anything about. Bradley called me in March of 2025, 9 months after the hearing, the first time he had called instead of texted in over 2 years. He did not apologize cleanly, because men like Bradley rarely do, but he said, in a voice smaller than I remembered from our marriage, that he had spent 9 years believing his own convenient version of who I was, because it let him leave a hospital room without having to carry what he was actually leaving behind, and that hearing General Voss read that file out loud, in a courtroom full of strangers, was the first time in 9 years he had let himself really look at me. I told him that Emily needed a father who showed up for the ordinary Tuesdays, not just the ones where a courtroom forced him to see clearly, and to his credit, in the 16 months since, he has mostly tried. We are not friends. We will likely never be. But he picks Emily up on time now, and he has stopped correcting people who ask him what her mother actually did in the army, and some weeks, that is the entire distance a person can travel, and I have learned to let that be enough. I think about that manila envelope sometimes, sitting in a safety deposit box for 9 years, not because I was building a legal strategy, but because some part of me knew that the truth does not need an audience to remain true. It only needs one, eventually, to become undeniable. I was never just paperwork. None of us who came home quietly, who let people believe the smaller, safer version of what we carried, were ever just paperwork. If somebody in your life has decided you are less than what you actually are, and you have been letting them believe it because the truth felt too heavy to hand to people who never once asked to carry it, what is it going to take for you to finally set that record straight? I still have the envelope, and there is one more page in that file I have never shown anyone outside a courtroom, The page with the second name on it, the name of the medic I couldn't bring back that night. The reason I carried 2 men out instead of 3. And that is a story I am not ready to tell you yet. Except to say that if you have made it this far with me, you already know enough about who I am to earn the rest of it. So subscribe now, because I am